I learned about this guy, Dan Wootton, from following Johnny and Amber, and you might know that Dan wrote bad things about Johnny in the Sun, false allegations as a matter of fact, and now Dan's got allegations out against him. But not only that, Dan has also been fired from the Mail Online, and now apparently from GB News. But let's talk about the details. This here is from the Byline Times, who I'm pretty convinced at this point has some inside info on Dan. They must be talking to someone working with Dan on the inside who doesn't like Dan, because they always have these really detailed reports about Dan that no one else does. It's from October 1st, 2023, pretty new, and it says GB News axes Dan Wootton after Fox Storm and catfish scandal. Full story. All right, so GB News and Mail Online is not saying that this catfish scandal is the reason, but it's probably connected. And what Byline Times says here is that this looks like a spontaneous thing. It looks like GB News suspended him because of what he said about this woman, but really, there's been other stuff going on that wasn't so good, and they're using it now as a way to move forward. Dan Evans and Tom Latcham reveal Dan Wootton's departure from GB News looks set to be permanent, and examine the true cost to the network of sticking by a £600,000 employee who broke editorial codes with impunity and engaged in sordid activities posing as the fictitious Martin Branning and Maria Joseph. Let's see what we got. Dan Wootton needs a miracle to save his £600,000 a year job as GB News star presenter, as owner Sir Paul Marshall seeks to detoxify the brand as he bids for the Daily Telegraph. So, my rough calculation, correct me if I'm wrong, but Dan was making about $1 million or more a year between the Mail Online and GB News. And now it seems both of those have come to an end. Well, some people might say this is karma. For the record, the suspension here I said I disagreed with for the most part, but that I didn't feel bad for Dan, of course. But now it makes more sense that this is more of something that was building up, not just because of this one incident. Dan, whose private and professional conduct has been the subject of a series of exposés by this newspaper, was informed on Friday that his services are unlikely to be required at the station again, alongside those of actor-turned-activist Lawrence Fox. They talk about Fox's sexist rant, misogynist rant about this woman, Ava Evans. They do mention that Dan laughed along. Dan didn't actually say the words. But honestly, I don't want to get hung up on this too much. I think what was said here, whether it was sexist or whatever, is actually mostly a separate issue from Dan. I mean, of course, Dan got the heat. Dan's getting suspended, or pretty much permanent, as they say. But I think it's more about the bigger picture here, that this has been building up, and what goes around comes around. GB News is also cutting ties with a third broadcaster, Calvin Robinson, who was a regular face on Wootton's show, and is reviewing the employment of a number of other employees ahead of a further Byline Times investigation to be published tomorrow. That's interesting. And last night, a GB News editorial source told this newspaper Dan Wootton has left the building, and a lot of people are relieved. There's been anger and disappointment about all the negative attention. Good journalists have been questioning their futures at the channel. Dan's face was left off a big promotion last week. It would be a miracle if he's seen here again. They got all the details, all the receipts. So I've been hearing things that I couldn't quite cover yet, that the staff at GB News, behind the scenes, the large majority of them doesn't like Dan. So that does mean, if true, which it seems it is, because, well, Dan's not so likable, this has been building. This isn't just because of this one incident. I mean, it seems strange to me that just laughing along with something could have such a harsh consequence. But thinking of recent history, that Dan was already in hot water, it makes sense and gives a little more credibility back to GB News that they wouldn't just, act so harsh over this comment or two. Okay, so here's where they mention that the Mail Online column was 250,000 pounds a year. So combine that with his 600,000 at GB, and that's about $1 million, I think a little more, which now is completely gone. A source close to the situation told Byline Times it has been made clear to Dan that he will not be broadcasting on GB News anytime soon, just as he will not be writing for the Mail Online. Right now, he feels as if he might just prefer to go back to Wellington to be near family, which is what he said before. That's always the go-to line. Well, I'm just gonna go be around my family. Okay, fine. They reinforce that this is not spontaneous, which it looked like on the surface, probably to some people. And to further reinforce this was not spontaneous, they say GB News was starting to look amateurish. Which, yeah, aside from the content of what was said and the nature of it, it is a little amateur to just say stuff like that on the news. Anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night. I happened to see this, had to make the video. It was pretty important. More to come later on in the week. If you're not subscribed here, consider it. If you don't, I'll be sad, but I'll get over it. See you next time.